The first sign something was wrong came with the toast. I stood at the edge of the grand hall, swirling a glass of Merlot, watching the glittering crowd revel in their shared obsession. Fine wine. My name's Adrian Cole, sommelier turned investigator. Most of my work revolved around counterfeit bottles or disputes over vintages, but tonight was different. This wasn't about fake labels. This was about revenge served in crystal glasses. The auction had been going perfectly. Chateau Lavigne had spared no expense, as always, turning their estate into a temple of excess. Bidders flew in from across the globe for the chance to own a bottle of the rare 1893 Saint-Pierre, a wine with a legendary backstory and a price tag that could rival a penthouse in Paris. Only 7 bottles were known to exist. Tonight's prize was considered the jewel of the collection, its existence steeped in myth and shadow. To history, a British bidder proclaimed, raising his glass of freshly poured red. A collective cheer followed. Moments later, he crumpled, clutching his throat, his glass slipping from his grasp. Chaos erupted. I dropped my own glass and rushed forward, instinct taking over. "Get him air!" someone shouted, though it was already too late. The man was convulsing, his face a grotesque shade of red. Across the room, 2 more people swayed on their feet, pale and panicked. The air was heavy with the acrid tang of spilled wine and the low hum of terror. "Seal the room!" I barked, addressing the estate staff. "Nobody leaves until we know what's going on." Minutes later, paramedics and police arrived, but my gut told me this wasn't an accident. Spoiled wine didn't make people collapse en masse. This was deliberate, calculated. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Jacques, looked pale as death. He tugged at my sleeve as the chaos unfolded. "Adrian, you don't think it's the Saint-Pierre?" I glanced at the bottle in question. It sat untouched on its pedestal, a radiant amber hue glinting under the chandelier. Not yet, but I'm thinking someone here knew exactly what they were doing. That's when I saw her, Celeste Laurent. She sat in a corner sipping water, completely unfazed by the panic around her. Her reputation was as sharp as her cheekbones, a collector with a merciless streak, known for snatching rare vintages out from under the wealthiest bidders. If this was about the Saint-Pierre, she had a strong motive. The paramedics confirmed what I feared, symptoms consistent with poisoning. The victim's glasses were quickly confiscated and tested, and every attendee was under scrutiny. I approached Jacques, who had access to the wine before the event. "Only the chateau staff and the vintner," he replied, dabbing sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. "The bottles were inspected for authenticity this morning. Nothing was out of place. Until it was." The more I scanned the room, the more questions surfaced. Was this a targeted attack, or was someone trying to send a message? My mind raced back to an infamous feud surrounding the Saint-Pierre. Decades ago, 2 collectors had fought bitterly over a stolen bottle from the same collection. One of those men was now dead. The other was standing across the room, his face ashen as the chaos unfolded. Celeste Laurent wasn't the only suspect. I circled back to the Saint-Pierre. It seemed to gleam with menace, untouched as if mocking the turmoil around it. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a battlefield. Whatever was going on, I knew one thing for certain. The poison wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning. The aftermath of the poisoning was pandemonium. Police cordoned off the auction room, separating the bidders into clusters for questioning. EMTs whisked the 3 victims away, though their prognosis was still unclear. I leaned against the bar, scanning the faces of the attendees. Wealth, arrogance, fear. They all wore their emotions differently, but one thing was certain. Someone in this room knew exactly what they had done. Celeste Laurent was the first person I approached. Her cold detachment earlier had stuck with me. She was leaning against the back wall, scrolling through her phone as if the evening hadn't just been shattered. "Celeste," I started, keeping my tone neutral. "You seem unusually calm for someone who just watched 3 people collapse." She didn't look up. "I wasn't the one drinking from poisoned glasses, Adrian." I folded my arms. "But you were here, bidding on the same prize as everyone else. You can't tell me you don't have a theory about what happened." Finally, her piercing eyes met mine. "If you're asking whether I poisoned them, you're wasting your breath. I'm not stupid enough to commit murder at an event teeming with cameras and police. She slipped her phone into her designer clutch. And besides, I have no interest in sabotaging an auction. My interest lies only in acquiring the Saint Pierre, which for the record I still intend to do. Her confidence made me bristle, but she wasn't wrong. If this was about the Saint Pierre, she would gain nothing by taking out her competition. Still, I didn't trust her. Next, I found Jacques pacing near the dais. His nerves were shot, and he flinched when I tapped his shoulder. Jacques, I need the list of bidders, I said firmly. If we're going to figure this out, we need to know who had the most to gain from this chaos. He nodded hastily and handed me a clipboard. As I scanned the names, one stood out immediately. Victor Moreau. He was the son of Edmond Moreau, one of the original collectors tied to the Saint Pierre feud. Edmond had died years ago, but his bitterness toward the Chateau Lavigne estate was legendary. Victor, now in his father's place, had built a reputation as a ruthless collector with a penchant for revenge. I found Victor near the center of the room, arguing with an officer about the confiscation of his glass. His fiery temper was on full display. "This is an outrage," he barked. "Do you know how much I paid to be here? To be treated like a criminal is—" "Victor," I interrupted, stepping into his line of sight. "Calm down. The police are just doing their job." He glared at me but relented, adjusting his silk tie. "Adrian Cole, I assume you're already sticking your nose where it doesn't belong?" "Just trying to figure out what happened." I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "But you've got to admit, this feels personal. You, of all people, know the history of the Saint Pierre." His eyes narrowed. "I know what you're implying, and you couldn't be more wrong. My family's feud with the chateau ended with my father's death. I'm here for the same reason everyone else is, to claim a piece of history." "Then you won't mind answering a few questions?" I replied, gesturing to the nearest officer. Victor's face darkened, but he nodded. "Fine. I've got nothing to hide." As the police took Victor aside, I mulled over the pieces I had so far. Celeste had no motive for sabotage, and Victor, while an obvious suspect, seemed too proud to resort to something this underhanded. But someone in this room had poisoned those glasses, and it wasn't just an accident. The Saint Pierre loomed in the background, untouched and pristine. It felt like the key to everything, a prize so coveted it could drive someone to murder. But as I stared at it, another thought crept into my mind. What if the poison wasn't about the wine at all? The longer I stared at the Saint Pierre, the more convinced I became that the poison wasn't the endgame. It was a distraction. Whoever orchestrated this chaos wasn't trying to kill indiscriminately. They were sending a message or covering their tracks. But why target an auction for a bottle of wine? And why now? Jacques reappeared by my side, his face pale and damp with sweat. "Adrian," he whispered, pulling me aside. "The poison. It wasn't in the wine." "What?" My voice came out sharper than intended, drawing the attention of a few nearby officers. I lowered my tone. "What do you mean it wasn't in the wine?" "They've tested the Saint Pierre and it's clean," Jacques said, trembling. "The glasses too. Whatever caused this, it wasn't from what they drank." A chill settled over me. "Then how?" Jacques glanced nervously around the room, then leaned in closer. "They think it was something on the table. Maybe the auction paddles or the menus. The victims all handled them just before they fell ill." My mind raced. If the poison was contact-based, it meant the culprit had been incredibly precise. They would have needed to know exactly which bidders would touch the contaminated items. That level of precision required not just planning, but access. I scanned the room again, this time focusing on the staff. The waiters, the security guards, even the auctioneer. They'd all moved freely among the bidders, unnoticed and unquestioned. One of them could have easily planted the poison. But as I watched them, another thought struck me. What if the poison wasn't targeting the bidders randomly? What if the victims were chosen for a reason? "Jacques," I said, turning back to him, "I need a list of the victims. Names, backgrounds, anything you've got." He nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Meanwhile, I moved toward the auctioneer, a wiry man named Paul who'd been running events like this for decades. He was arguing with a police officer, his frustration evident. "Paul," I called, interrupting their exchange. "I need to ask you something." He turned to me exasperated. "Adrian, I don't have time for this. They're tearing apart my auction over what? A little food poisoning?" "This isn't food poisoning," I snapped. "3 people were deliberately targeted. Now tell me, who had access to the paddles and menus before the auction started?" Paul hesitated, his bravado fading. "Well, the staff set up everything, but the paddles were prepared earlier, in the back room." "Who was in charge of that?" "A few of the assistants, and—" He stopped, his face going pale. "Celeste. She insisted on inspecting the paddles before the auction started." "Celeste?" My mind reeled. She was one of the lead organizers, a polished professional who'd been the face of the event for weeks. Why would she be involved? Jacques returned at that moment, thrusting a piece of paper into my hands. "Here's the list," he said breathlessly. I scanned the names of the victims. Gregory Linton, a wealthy art dealer with ties to shady antique trades. Samantha Hayes, a legal consultant known for brokering high-stakes deals. And Charles Belmont, a former wine merchant turned private collector. A pattern began to emerge. All 3 had histories in industries that brushed against the darker edges of legality. Gregory and Samantha, in particular, had ties to scandals involving counterfeit goods. And Charles? He'd been embroiled in a lawsuit with Chateau Lavigne itself years ago, accused of trying to smuggle fake vintages into their collection. "Jacques," I said slowly, "this wasn't random. The victims were targeted because of their connections. Someone wanted to send a message, and the Saint-Pierre is at the center of it." Jacques frowned. "But who'd go to these lengths just to make a point?" "I don't know," I admitted, pocketing the list. "But whoever it is, they've planned this for years." At that moment, a commotion erupted near the entrance. 2 officers were struggling to hold back a frantic man shouting in rapid French. It was the distributor who'd authenticated the Saint-Pierre, his face ashen and his words garbled. "They're lying," he bellowed. "The bottle. It's not the Saint-Pierre. It's a fake." His declaration sent a ripple through the room, every head turning toward the bottle on display. Fake? I felt my stomach churn. If the Saint-Pierre wasn't real, then this wasn't just about the poison. It was a multi-layered con, and we were only scratching the surface. The distributor's claim hung in the air like an unspoken threat, rippling through the crowd. Paul looked as if he'd been struck. "A fake?" he sputtered, his voice rising above the murmurs of disbelief. "That's impossible. We authenticated it ourselves." The distributor broke free from the officers and stormed toward the display case, pointing at the bottle with trembling hands. "I swear on my reputation, that bottle is not the Saint-Pierre. Someone swapped it." I didn't need the distributor's theatrics to confirm what I already suspected. This entire event, from the poisonings to the mysterious counterfeit bottle, was a meticulously orchestrated scheme. Someone wanted to cripple Chateau Lavigne and destroy its legacy. The question was, why? Jacques pulled me aside, his face pale. "Adrian, if that bottle's a fake, the value of the real Saint-Pierre just skyrocketed. This could be about more than revenge. This could be about the black market." "True," I said, scanning the room. "But someone wanted this to be messy. If they were just after profit, why poison the bidders? Why risk exposing the swap?" Jacques didn't have an answer, and neither did I. All I knew was that we were dealing with a culprit who wasn't afraid to operate on multiple fronts: deception, sabotage, and outright murder. "Jacques," I said, "we need to speak to Celeste." We found her in the corner of the room, her usual poise replaced by a fragile calm. She was speaking to one of the officers, her expression measured. When she spotted us approaching, her composure faltered. "Adrian," she greeted me, her voice tight. "I assume you've heard the commotion. This is a disaster." "Disaster doesn't begin to cover it," I said. "Celeste, I need to know, why did you personally inspect the auction paddles?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of indignation crossing her face. "Because it's my job to ensure everything runs smoothly." "I didn't tamper with anything, Adrian. Are you accusing me of something?" "Not yet," I said evenly, "but the poison wasn't in the wine. It was on the paddles. And you're the only one who touched them before they were handed out." She stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Are you seriously suggesting I poisoned our guests?" "Why would I do that?" Jacques stepped forward. Celeste, 3 of the victims have ties to scandals involving counterfeit goods in Chateau Lavigne. You have access, opportunity, and possibly a motive. Her face flushed, and she took a step back. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've worked for Chateau Lavigne for 10 years. Why would I jeopardize my career for something like this? Her protest sounded genuine, but something about her demeanor felt off. Before I could press further, Paul approached us, looking harried. The distributor's demanding we verify the bottle, he said, his voice low. If it's truly a fake, this entire auction will implode. Jacques and I exchanged a look. Let's do it, I said. If the bottle's a counterfeit, we need to confirm it now. The room grew tense as the bottle was carefully removed from its display and placed on the examination table. The distributor, still shaking with fury, began his analysis under the watchful eyes of the officers and auction staff. Minutes felt like hours as he checked the label, the cork, the sediment. Finally, he stepped back, his face grim. This is not the Saint Pierre. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by frantic whispers. Paul looked as though he might collapse. How? He croaked. How could this have happened? Before anyone could answer, one of the officers' radios crackled to life. Dispatch to Unit 7. We've apprehended a suspect attempting to leave the premises with unauthorized items. Requesting backup. My heart leapt. Who is it? The officer on the radio didn't respond, but moments later, the doors burst open and 2 officers entered, dragging a struggling man between them. It was one of the waiters. He was young, barely out of his 20s, and his face was a mask of desperation. In his hands, he clutched a small black bag. I didn't do anything, he shouted. You're making a mistake. The officers forced the bag open, revealing its contents. Auction paddles, gloves, and a vial of clear liquid. Looks like we found our poisoner, one of the officers said grimly. But as I stared at the waiter, a new sense of unease crept over me. This felt too easy, too neat. Jacques, I murmured, what if he's not the mastermind? What if he's just a pawn? Jacques frowned. Then the real culprit is still in the room. And as I scanned the faces of the stunned guests, I realized the answer was closer than I wanted to admit. The waiter's protest rang out across the room, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the guests. He was dragged toward the officer's holding area, his bag of incriminating evidence trailing behind him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just seen the surface of something much deeper. Jacques, I muttered, keeping my voice low. If the waiter is just a pawn, then someone set him up to take the fall. The paddles, the poison, none of this was his doing. He was just the delivery system. Jacques nodded, his jaw tight. But how do we prove that? And who's behind it? I scanned the room, taking in the guests. Each face told a different story. Fear, confusion, suspicion. But one stood out. Celeste. She was talking to Paul now, gesturing animatedly, her face flushed. Something about her demeanor was unnerving. We start with her, I said. Jacques frowned. Celeste? Why? She handled the paddles, I explained, and she's been acting strange since this whole thing started. If she's not directly involved, she knows something. We approached her just as Paul was leaving, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She turned to us, her expression guarded. What now? She asked, her voice clipped. Celeste, I said, keeping my tone measured. The poison was on the paddles. You were the last person to handle them before they were distributed. Can you explain how that happened? Her eyes narrowed. I've already told you. I don't know. I inspected the paddles like I always do. They were clean. If someone tampered with them, it happened after I handed them over. Who else had access to them? Jacques pressed. No one, she snapped. I locked them in the storage room after the inspection. Only Paul and I have keys. Jacques and I exchanged a look. Then either you're lying, I said, or Paul is involved. Her face darkened. Paul would never... Before she could finish, an officer approached us. Mr. Caldwell, he said, addressing me, we've finished questioning the waiter. He claims he was paid to plant the paddles, but doesn't know who hired him. Says the instructions came through an anonymous message. Did he say anything about the bottle? Jacques asked. The officer shook his head. He claims he had nothing to do with it. I mulled over the new information. The waiter's story added another layer to the mystery. If someone had gone to such lengths to frame him, they were not only meticulous, but also deeply entrenched in this event. "Where's Paul?" I asked suddenly. Celeste hesitated. He went to the cellar. He said he needed to check on the remaining bottles." Jacques and I didn't waste a second. We made our way to the cellar, the air growing colder as we descended the narrow staircase. The cellar was vast, rows upon rows of priceless vintages lining the walls. But it was empty, no sign of Paul. "Paul?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer. Jacques pointed to a door at the far end of the room. "The vault," he said. We approached cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, and as we pushed it open, we were met with a sight that stopped us in our tracks. Paul was slumped over the desk, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. In his hand, he clutched a piece of paper. Jacques rushed to him, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," he said, relief evident in his voice. I took the paper from Paul's hand. It was a note scrawled in messy handwriting. "Leave it alone, or you're next." A chill ran down my spine. "Jacques," I said, my voice shaking, "this isn't just about the wine. This is personal." We helped Paul back upstairs, where he was examined by paramedics. He was shaken but unharmed. "The note," he said, his voice hoarse. "It was on my desk when I got to the cellar. I don't know how it got there." I didn't believe him. Not entirely. Paul was hiding something, and whatever it was enough to make him a target. Celeste joined us, her face pale. "What's happening, Adrian? Who would do this?" "That's what we're going to find out," I said. "But first, we need to secure the remaining bottles. If the Saint Pierre is a fake, the others might be too." As we returned to the main hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The guests, the staff, anyone could be involved. And whoever was behind this, they weren't done yet. This wasn't just about wine. This was a game, and we were all pawns. The aftermath of Paul's discovery lingered over the auction like a thick fog. His note, "Leave it alone, or you're next," was now burned into my mind. It was a threat, a promise, and perhaps a confession all rolled into one. But from whom and why? I watched as Jacques worked to secure the remaining bottles, his gloves carefully inspecting each one for tampering. Celeste hovered nearby, nervously biting her lip. She looked like she wanted to say something, but her fear kept her silent. "Adrian," Jacques said, breaking the silence, "there's something off about these bottles." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. He held up one of the vintages, its label pristine, its cork flawless. To an untrained eye, it was a masterpiece. But Jacques had spent years in this world, and he wasn't fooled. "The weight is wrong," he explained. "It's subtle, but this bottle is heavier than it should be. If I had to guess, the contents aren't what they seem." "You think it's fake?" Celeste asked, her voice trembling. Jacques nodded. "I'll need to test it to be sure, but I'd bet my career on it." A hush fell over us as the implications sank in. If the bottles were counterfeit, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to pull off this con. It wasn't just a matter of money. It was a matter of reputation, of trust, of legacy. I turned to Celeste. "You said only you and Paul have access to the storage room. Is there anyone else who could have gotten in? A staff member, a contractor, anyone?" She shook her head. "No one, and the locks haven't been tampered with. I checked them myself." Jacques frowned. "Then it had to happen before the bottles arrived at the venue. Which means it's someone with access to the supply chain," I said, my mind racing. "The distributor, the transporter, maybe even the vineyard itself." Celeste looked horrified. "The vineyard? You think they'd risk their reputation for this?" "It's not impossible," Jacques said grimly, "but we won't know until we test the bottles." Before we could continue, an officer approached us. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, addressing me, "we've finished questioning the guests. A few of them mentioned overhearing an argument between Paul and another man earlier today. A man who wasn't on the guest list." My stomach sank. "Do they know who it was?" The officer shook his head. "They didn't get a good look at him, but they said he was tall, well-dressed, and seemed agitated." Tall, well-dressed, and agitated. That could describe half the people in this room, but something about it nagged at me. "Jacques," I said, turning to him, Did you see anyone matching that description earlier? He thought for a moment before shaking his head. Number. But if he wasn't on the guest list, he'd have to sneak in. And the only place to do that is through the service entrance. Then let's start there, I said. We made our way to the service entrance, a narrow hallway tucked away behind the main auction room. It was dimly lit and eerily quiet, the kind of place where secrets could hide in plain sight. Jacques examined the door, his fingers tracing the lock. It's been picked, he said, his voice grim. Recently, too. Whoever did this was careful, I said, my eyes scanning the floor for clues. They didn't leave anything behind. But then Jacques bent down, his gloved hand reaching for something near the corner of the doorframe. When he stood up, he was holding a small scrap of fabric, deep red, with an intricate gold pattern. That's not from any of the uniforms, Celeste said, her brow furrowing. No, Jacques agreed. This is high-end. Custom. Then whoever was here wasn't just sneaking in, I said. They wanted to be noticed, at least by the right people. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was far from clear. Someone had infiltrated the auction, tampered with the bottles, and poisoned the paddles. They'd framed the waiter, threatened Paul, and now left us a breadcrumb trail to follow. But to what end? As we returned to the main hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The guests were restless, the tension palpable, and somewhere in this room, the mastermind behind this elaborate game was watching, waiting, and pulling the strings. Jacques, I said quietly, we need to get out ahead of this. Whoever's behind it, they're not done yet. He nodded, his expression steely. Agreed, but we're running out of time. Little did we know, time was the least of our worries. As the auction hall hummed with nervous murmurs, Jacques and I retreated to the cellar to examine the tampered bottles. Celeste followed reluctantly, clutching her clipboard like it could somehow shield her from the gravity of the situation. The heavy door shut behind us, sealing us in a room lined with ancient oak racks, dim lights casting long shadows on the stone walls. The air smelled faintly of wine and dust, a place that should have been serene, yet now felt ominous. Jacques set the suspect bottles on the workbench, his movements deliberate. If these are counterfeit, they'll have one of two things: a variance in density or trace chemicals from artificial aging. Either way, the lab will confirm it. We don't have time for a lab, I said, leaning over him. If the bottles are a sham, we need proof now. Jacques sighed and grabbed a precision scale from the cabinet. He placed the first bottle, a rare Chateau Margaux, 1959, on the scale. It tipped slightly heavier than expected, just as Jacques had suspected. He grabbed a syringe and carefully pierced the cork, withdrawing a tiny sample of the wine. The liquid shimmered darkly in the vial, and Jacques held it up to the light. Looks like wine, he said, his voice low, but looks can be deceiving. He pulled out a handheld spectrometer and inserted the sample. The machine beeped and whirred before spitting out a readout. Jacques scanned the results and his expression darkened. This isn't Chateau Margaux, he muttered. It's synthetic. Someone mixed ethanol, colorants, and stabilizers to mimic the profile of an aged wine. A decent forgery, but forgery nonetheless. Celeste gasped. Then whoever bought these bottles tonight was buying a lie, I finished grimly. And they were willing to kill to keep it hidden. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Jacques tested the other bottles, each revealing the same deception. The counterfeiting wasn't just sloppy work. It was a calculated operation targeting the most discerning collectors. Whoever did this didn't just infiltrate the auction, Jacques said. They've been running this scam for years, building a network of fake bottles to flood the market. And the poisoning? I asked. How does that fit in? Jacques hesitated. Maybe they wanted to cover their tracks. A handful of sick bitters would create enough chaos to let them slip away unnoticed. Or maybe it was a warning to anyone who got too close to the truth. A faint sound broke the silence, pulling us from our thoughts. It was coming from outside the cellar. A faint creak, like footsteps on the old wooden floor above us. Did you hear that? Celeste whispered, her eyes wide. Jacques nodded, his hand reaching instinctively for the corkscrew he'd left on the workbench. It wasn't much of a weapon, But in this moment, it was better than nothing. Stay here, I said, stepping toward the door. Adrian, wait, Celeste said, grabbing my arm. What if it's the person who did this? That's what I'm counting on. I eased the door open, stepping into the narrow hallway. The dim light barely illuminated the path ahead, but I could see shadows shifting at the far end. Someone was there, watching us. Who's there? I called out, my voice echoing down the stone corridor. No answer. Jacques appeared behind me, corkscrew in hand. I don't like this, he muttered. The shadows moved again, and then we saw him. A man stepped into the light, his face obscured by a scarf and wide-brimmed hat. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but the glint of something metallic in his hand told me he wasn't here for conversation. Nice work, the man said, his voice low and mocking. But you're out of your depth. Who are you? I demanded, taking a step forward. Someone who doesn't appreciate meddling, he said. You should have left well enough alone. Jacques stepped up beside me. You're the one who left the note for Paul, he said, his voice steady, and the one who poisoned the paddles. The man chuckled darkly. Paul was an unfortunate casualty. He got greedy, started asking questions he wasn't supposed to. Just like you. Before I could respond, the man raised his arm and I caught a glimpse of the small device in his hand, a remote detonator. Step back, he warned, his thumb hovering over the button. This whole cellar's wired. One wrong move, and this auction goes up in flames. Jacques froze, his eyes darting to the walls. You're bluffing, he said. Am I? The man replied, his tone icy. You want to test that theory? I held up my hands, trying to defuse the situation. Look, we don't want any trouble. Just tell us what you want. What I want, he said, taking a step closer, is for you to disappear. Forget you ever saw me. Forget this whole night ever happened. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The cellar felt like a tomb, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. But as the man's thumb moved closer to the detonator, I realized there was only one choice. I lunged. The last thing I heard was the sharp crack of glass breaking. And then the world erupted in chaos.